There you have it. So today I want to get started. That outline that I sent to you is meant to be for the whole week. So I don't know if I'm going to get through all the 12 points, but I'm going to get started with, I think, 3 or 4 today. And I thought that maybe I should preface this by saying, in the spirit of critical theory, what do I want with this? Where is this going? The dominant paradigm in academia today, especially when it comes to the humanities and the social sciences, is that of liberal identitarianism. I reject that paradigm for many reasons that I draw from my background as a German Hegelian Marxist. So, and I'm going to share some of the reasons for that with you in this lecture. First, I want to contrast the approaches to knowing things and explaining them that are different between philosophy and history. Philosophers will usually insist that you look at a work that a philosopher wrote in an immanent way. You look for how it works together as a logic, as a system of thought. And if you were to try and say, oh, he wrote this because he was a child of his times, and it was shaped by this or that experience or whatnot, that would be considered a dilution of the philosophical content. You're supposed to see how the argument holds up systematically, whether the internal logic works. Now, of course, that also entails that you might want to fact check. You want to see if what is being said is true. But those are two different things. The internal logic as well as the question of truth. Now, historians, on the other hand, tend to over-contextualize. Historians look at the way that things were specific to a time. To find that somebody represented that time or was ahead of it is something that historians would say more readily than they would try and argue about the internal consistency of the source, or even about the truth content. So that is something to keep in mind. History probably can learn from philosophy in this aspect, in that it is important not to neglect the internal consistency and not to overemphasize that thing which you found in Hegel, to rely on the account of the valet or valet, as you might say, the butler. Nobody, Hegel says in the philosophy of history, nobody is a hero to their valet, but not because the one is not a hero, but because the other one is a valet. So you can say any number of things about a person of historical significance, for instance, about their moral qualifications, or about their personal choices, about the consistency of their actions with their beliefs, and so forth. But that does not eliminate the need to look at the actions and the beliefs and to describe them faithfully, each in their own right. And of course, as an example of that just pops into my mind, that I found enlightening for the mindset of this liberal identitarianism that I reject, at a conference that took place. It was the Western conference of the American Historical Association, and I attended a session that was mostly centered around scholars, younger scholars, grad students from UC Merced, who were studying the Central Valley, 19th century race relations, borderland interactions between Mexico and Southern California, and so forth. And one scholar had studied a Mexican anarchist leader who was popular before World War I. Since I didn't think I would use this example, of course, I didn't look up the name, but you've heard it. This leader, we know, was once married, and she discovered in her research that he had been married once before. The first wife was the daughter of a publisher who was responsible for publishing the anarchist newspaper that played an important role in organizing workers, migrants, etc., in Los Angeles and in all of California. This paper was financed not just through subscriptions, but also by the donations from this immigrant labor force. So when one day it turned out that the father-in-law had absconded with the treasury of that newspaper that contained all that hard-earned money of immigrants, this anarchist leader was upset with his wife. Apparently, she took the side of her father, and they broke off all contact, and her existence was fully omitted from any further account of his political or personal life. In recovering this first marriage and the abandonment of his wife and child, the scholar interpreted this as a condemnation of this labor leader. He had shown himself to be a macho. He had shown himself to be disdainful of women and their rights. And he had violated that trust with his family. So that, of course, to her also entailed that you could legitimately dismiss his political project of anarchism, kind of like an anarcho-syndicalism in a broader context, as a patriarchal and therefore ultimately false political project. Her advisor was present and asked, what if somebody asked you about this dismissal and questioned this and said that maybe there was something politically salvageable about this anarchism? She replied that I would tell them that the private is political, which is, of course, an old adage of feminism. Therefore, it follows that the personal conduct and his interactions with his first wife and child from that marriage is all we need to know about him to judge his historical significance. So this is one of the examples for what course historicization of ideas may take. And so for that reason, this question of how we get to a valid interpretation, what was the role, for instance, of this leader, seems to require certain steps to take in terms of finding out what really happened, what the actors involved in the story did, and so forth. Because there was no doubt in the mind of this scholar, based on the evidence, that yes, his wife had collaborated with her father to steal the money that the workers had raised and that had been used for the newspaper, which subsequently folded and had thereby doomed this political program. The only issue was whether it was justified, therefore, to basically treat her like she had never existed. So the question that is underlying this approach to interpretation, in my view, we need to understand to be ultimately about epistemology. It is about what we look at for evidence, what counts as evidence for us, by what method do we know that this evidence is valid and that claims we make about it are valid. And there are many different, or three main different ways, really, that I'm aware of, that we can look at to describe the relation between, first of all, the word and the thing, because that's the first step of epistemology. The words we use to talk about the world, the words specifically we use to describe a particular thing. What is the relationship between that word and that thing? In scholasticism, and going back quite a ways, the dominant paradigm was one of realism. Here the assumption is, and the re in realism means like the thing. Here we assume that the thing is pretty much congruent with the word, because the word and the essence of the thing are both given by God. There's something true, something real, an ontological essence to each individual item in the world we might describe. And the word that we use to describe that item reflects. The point would be to find out what the exact right word is for any given thing. And of course, this is not just about material objects, mind you, because before somebody gets the idea that this is somehow different, depending on whether we treat natural sciences or social sciences and humanities, it isn't. Because for us, that much is clear, regardless from the philosophical approach, the thought is an object. It is an object just as much as the table. And the table, once thought, becomes a thought object. You read that in Hegel already, I think, in the part that we read. So regardless of what the object may be, whether it's material or ideal, abstract or concrete, it doesn't matter. It is turned by us in that we think about it into the same kind of material. So it is a false dichotomy to say this is a different story, whether we talk about a table or the concept of justice, say. It isn't. Now, this first way of thinking, the realist, that says there is an ontological essence and that the word is a reflection thereof, was challenged at different times historically, but one particularly who challenged it was William of Ockham, who you probably know from the Umberto Eco novel, The Name of the Rose, fictionalized. Ockham, as a philosopher, rejected realism, the direct correspondence between word and thing, and instead went with something we call nominalism. The word is an arbitrary choice, something in the world that we as humans name, but it is not divine in origin. It is absolutely human in origin. We make up the words. The things are accessible to us and reflected by us through words that are of our own making. So in the first example of the realism, human thinking is bounded by the structure of the world, pre-existing and put there by God. We, in order to think correctly, need to find out what it is and what it means, and then find the right words to express it. In nominalism, on the other hand, there really is nothing that is in any way organized in the natural world or the world of ideas and compelling us to follow it along. It is always just or stating that this is how we call it and this is what we do with it. So you might see easily what the problem is with the first way of thinking, where it may not leave enough leeway for thinking about the contingency of the human mind, of how we might add or subtract something in the process of thinking about the thing. That there may be a naivete to saying our words and our thinking reflects the world and gets at that ontological essence. The problem with the nominalism, on the other hand, may be not so easy to pick up, because if the world is the toy for our mental caprice, if we can just name things this way or that, there is no necessary connection between us and these things in the world, or thoughts, or people. It is much more a question of power, of being able to command the things in the world to obey certain words. So if there is any kind of compelling reason to observe limitations to our thinking, like having to follow a logic, having to speak clearly, having to say things that are truthful, that doesn't follow from that. Or at least you have to introduce it after the original theory has been thought up. So as a synthesis, as it were, that does justice to both the idea that, yes, of course, the concepts are ours. We think them. The word, regardless of what Genesis might say, the word did not materialize itself. The material is given to us and we find the word. But it is also not random, and it is not something that we just make up. In the formulation of the German philosopher Günther Mensching, who studied Ockham, on whose work I'm relying for this account for the largest part. What logic is compulsion wrought by nature, sublimated in the human mind. In other words, once we realize how nature really works, and once we are clear that there are laws that apply to it, then we realize that our thinking doesn't just have to reflect the things, but also the relations between things and the laws that govern them, and so forth. So if we are supposed to come to build, to reconstruct in our minds an accurate picture of the world, notably one that's workable and ensures for us as a species our success, then it had better get into the essence of things, which for us is how these things relate to us and to each other, and how we think about them in a way that we understand this interaction. And the mediating factor is activity, where it is not just the thing out there that is complete with its essence in its meaning, nor is it the meaningless thing that we give a word a name and thereby give it meaning, but it's both at the same time, back and forth, a process of mediation, and that is activity. We engage with the object. We do something. We want something. Now, for Hegel, this activity is thought or thinking. In that we think about the things. We realize their meaning. We give them meaning. We recognize how they work together. For Marx, in the next step, that process, that activity is labor, in that we build something from these things and that we appropriate them. Now, Marx does not ditch the thought aspect, the ideal aspect of activity. For Marx, it is both these things. But while for Hegel, it is an idealistic framework where what really matters is the way we think about things, for Marx, it is a materialistic one. The basis is how we work with things, what we do with them, what we want with them. But that too, if we engage with the natural world, for instance, in order to put a nail into a wall where we want to hang a picture of Marx, we would be well advised to understand abstract concepts like cause and effect, specific weight, gravity, density, and so forth. Plus the the properties of different materials, like what is this wall made of? Is there an electrical power line just behind it? What is the nail made of? Is it suitable for the test? And if we didn't have an understanding of cause and effect, for instance, and we hit our thumb with a hammer, we may be surprised about that sensation of pain that we feel. But of course, that happens once or twice, so to speak, in human history. And after that, it is more or less settled that if you hit yourself on the thumb with a hammer, it is going to be painful. So you should probably not do that. And this illustrates, in a simple way, that, of course, activity and the formation of concepts can be related in a way that makes sense. Why does all of this matter, especially to historians? Have we not abandoned this notion that there is an objective truth that we as historians can describe? Should we bother with this kind of stuff? I think it matters because naturally people always make claims about the validity of statements, about whether or not something is in fact the case. So we see these claims made by the people we study. They will say this happened, or this didn't happen, or this person did it to that other person. And it is our job to figure out whether that's true. And then the next step, of course, would be to interpret it. We make our own synthetic statements, which too we assume have validity. There's a professional standard by which our peers decide this is a true and valid statement. Two different things, but they come out the same. Let's think of a few examples for standards of validity and why they matter. First, when you look at the legal system, which is considered by some to be in charge of making sure that right is done. Hegel writes the philosophy not of laws, but the philosophy of right, which is both. It is laws, it is justice, it is the proper way of doing it. So custom, in other words. When you go to court, there is a process that is hopefully meticulous and scrupulous to find out which side is telling the truth, who did what, who said what, and who is culpable for it. And you have a reasonable expectation, you should have an expectation that the result of a trial in court is to have that truth honored, to have somebody who punched you in the face not get away with saying, no, I didn't do that, but if I did it, he had it coming. And also, I shouldn't be held accountable for it, because if I hadn't done it, somebody else might. So, no, you would want justice to be done. And justice, of course, is another one of those terms that come today with a certain burden in a general form. You might not want justice in general, you might want equity, specific kinds of justice, social justice, that apply not in a blanket fashion, but specifically to this other group. In politics, you have claims that people make, like a student, when I introduced this semester, the masking requirement, who said, did you know that there's research that proves that masks do not have an effect on the spread of diseases? So there is natural science out there. There's medical science. There's all kinds of research on fabrics, particle flow in the air, possibly turbidity currents. I don't know if that's related. Some of it is chaotic and complicated, but one thing is crystal clear. If you look at the actual peer-reviewed science, then there is nothing better as a first line of defense than to wear a mask. There is no harm from it, and there is nothing but benefits from it. So how do you deal with someone who comes to you and makes a claim that some might consider disinformation? I don't know why we need the term disinformation, because we could simply say it is not true. Usually somebody will then say, well, but I did my research. I spent a lot of time on YouTube, as well as the interwebs in general, where people showed their work and said, yes, there is a doctor in England, he's a veterinarian, and he studied this for 2 weeks and he knows exactly how it works. I'm exaggerating here. They'll always find somebody who they can declare an expert, which is a neat trick, because while perhaps in scientific discourse, with liberal identitarianism being a very much dominant paradigm, not just in the humanities, but leaking into the natural sciences as well, we have a tendency to, on the one hand, question truth content, but on the other hand, rely strongly on authority of experts, that expertise. For instance, the number of times I've been blocked by people on social media whose last words were like, I'm an expert in this field, for voicing a disagreement and combining that with what I consider to be an argument. That shut it down. So we somehow have to deal with this, because if you simply have competing claims of expertise, you obviously need some underlying universal standard of truth, or at least validity. And finally, in the field of culture, one of the frequently heard claims is that you cannot possibly understand this because you don't share the experience of that other person. And that serves as the foundation for any number of political and cultural practice that we associate with liberal identitarianism. There are things you can say to some people, but not to others, based on these people having specific experience. For instance, let me look at an example that is philosophical. I have never been in a building that collapsed. And I am not an expert on seismology or statics or architecture. I don't know anything about construction engineering either. If somebody had been in a building that collapsed and survived the harrowing experience, then they certainly would have the experience that gives them a personal stake in understanding the effects of seismology, or the teachings of seismology, statics, architecture, construction engineering, and so on and so forth, possibly public laws and regulations about building safety, and so forth. However, it would be a stretch to say that the person who was trapped in a collapsed building, therefore, has become an expert in statics, engineering, seismology, etc., etc. In other words, suffering, personal experience that gives you a stake in understanding something, by no means conveys the knowledge and understanding. So to say you cannot discuss the subject of statics with the survivor of a building collapse, even though you may be an engineer or an architect, would be a claim consistent with the identitarian approach of standpoint epistemology that says that personal experience, lived experience, is the only reliable standard of valid insight. So based on this assumption that truth is a fishy concept, that it usually probably comes from the point of wanting to explain why you understand better than another person what their lived experience is or signifies. I think it comes from that source. When somebody once said to me, quote, "You sound like a right-wing religious nutcase." And this was one of my favorite students who didn't have filters. And I don't have filters either, so I understand that and work well with it. She said other things as well. I forget some of them. In response to what? In response to me insisting in a discussion in class that yes, I do believe that there is a valid concept of truth, and there is a truth to concepts. In other words, I embrace the realist position in its dialectical formulation that words do describe things in a valid way, and that statements can be tested for their truth content. There's a pragmatic argument for that, not just the philosophical, because for the philosophical, we'll spend more time with Hegel and then with Marx to discuss about how exactly that works. But there are practical considerations here for why I would say we need to insist on a concept of truth. One, again, was what if somebody punches you in the face? What happened to this person? Or, and here we get to teachable local examples. Who killed Saleh al-Karbawi? Anyone? You did?
No.
You want to say something to the?
No.
To explain it? Who is that anyway? I would go so far as to say that ultimately Fresno State as an institution caused the death of Saleh al-Karbawi. He was a professor of Islamic architecture in the Department of Interior Design. He was a Muslim from Egypt and considered a capacity in his field. As such, he was hired here, and his enthusiasm for teaching and his disdain for, the formalities of job training and so forth made him one of probably, if not the most popular professors in this place. If you look at his still existing ratemyprofessor.com page, it is a solid wall of 5.0. Everything is green, and people all write a paragraph, multiple ones per semester. So what did he do to get himself killed? He did a number of. For instance, he supported the cause of Palestinian independence. Secondly, he advocated for older women who were lecturers in the Department of Interior Design, who were not even considered in the hiring process where some newer people were brought in. And he also blew the whistle when in the College of Arts and Humanities, which includes the School of Interior Design, people fudged numbers and made things up when it came to the application for re-accreditation of the program. And when his objections were not heard by the competent authorities in the school, he threatened or decided to go public because he thought this wasn't. In response to that, Joseph Castro put Saleh al-Kabawi on leave. As a tenured professor, you can only do that for 4 weeks at a time. And then you are back, except there's nothing to prevent you, especially if the union doesn't stop you from doing it, from issuing another 30-day suspension subsequently and consecutively for a total, in this case, of 4 years, up until his death. Karbawi was accused, but I've read the entire court files, was accused of many different things. Like he was given a class to teach where you had to teach the software program so that people can become architects. And apparently he said, forget about it. You can learn that yourself. It's trivial. We're going to go out and look at architectural styles in the built environment around us here, and we'll do creative things. They found one student, female student, who was willing to say, without elaborating on it, and put it on paper, that Karbawi made her personally uncomfortable. And that was about it for the actual facts that they brought to the court to say, why did they suspend him for 4 years in a row? So Karbawi thought, this is America, justice prevails, I'm going to hire a lawyer. The strategy of Fresno State was relentless. And for instance, they blocked his access to email. And then the lawyers would say, well, why don't you provide the evidence? And he would say, well, it's in the email. For instance, I felt this one student who ended up making that complaint. So they prevented him from gathering the evidence. Then they threatened with deadlines and so forth. Then they dragged out deadlines that they were under. In the end, Karbawi's first lawyer attempted suicide. That is the extent to which Fresno State relentlessly and with characteristic inhumanity treated this person. Eventually, another letter reached him from the court. He opened it, and it is my best guess that on that day, he had already sought treatment in Los Angeles for heart disease. He died of a heart attack when opening and reading. He was discovered by his lawyer 3 weeks later. He was buried in a grave under a misspelled gravestone by county employees who by that time had decided they couldn't find any next of kin and had sold his stuff. The retired Fresno Bee reporter, Pablo Lopez, accidentally found, he's a court reporter, he accidentally found those files. He didn't have much to do, retirement and whatnot, wrote it up for his blog. I found it, I tweeted about it. It was like there should be justice for this man, and named him. And then months later, this was in October 22, 11 months after the death, I get a message on Twitter saying, my name is Mohammed Al-Kabawi. I'm from Cairo, and I would like to know if you have any information about my brother. I saw you tweeted it. So his brother, his family, nobody was told. He was just a dead Muslim to them. And, of course, somebody who was entirely disposable. There were many, many helpers. It was not just Joseph Castro and the university administration. For instance, Kabawi had asked for the trial to be held in Los Angeles, which is where the university system is located. Fresno State filed to have it moved to Fresno, where they hoped, with much justification, for a better legal environment. Many individuals working in academic and administrative positions in the school signed their little papers sent to the court to say, I could not possibly go to Los Angeles, and therefore I object, because I would be likely to be asked as a witness. I object to this venue and want it to be moved to Fresno. The names are all public record in the files of the court. So who is responsible for the death of Saleh Al-Kabawi? To what extent are all these individuals who did their part as cogs in the machine? To what extent is Joseph Castro, who treated people like objects as a sport? To what extent are the faculty members in the union or in the academic senate who for years let him get away with it because it didn't affect them, that worked well for them? This is a question of some concern, especially for his brother and his surviving relatives. But I also think that anybody with half a sense of ethics should make it theirs. When Mohammed Kabawi visited Fresno in late 2022, he tried to get somebody in the media to pay attention. G.B. Wire ran a short personal interest piece on it. The Collegian interviewed him and never published anything. And the Fresno Bee, you can't expect them to say anything about Fresno State in the first place because they share the same social and demographic background. So this is a question where truth, justice, what really happened, who made false claims, who is responsible for the death of this person, is a very practical one. And it's a local example that we might consider. Here you have an example of perhaps what Mensching considers to be a legacy of the nominalist tradition. If you operate in a mental framework where everything is more or less a question of language play, therefore power to define what things are, then the truth of this actual person whose life ended because of your actions is somehow not as much of a problem. Because after all, if nobody holds you accountable for lies, for deception, for murder, then is it really a lie? Was it really murder? Are you really capable of these things? So for that reason, I would argue we absolutely do need a concept of truth. I don't know if this is too far-fetched. Are you seeing the connection? Okay, fair enough. Two more examples. The second one, you have groups of people going around, and this also has a strong local component, but it's nationwide. Going around accusing gay people, transgender people, especially transgender women, of being quote unquote groomers. This is a rallying cry of the far right in trying to essentially criminalize the existence of transgender people, or at the minimum, drive them from public life and force them to live, in the bodies that do not reflect their gender identity. This too involves claims of medical authority about transition procedures and so forth that are bogus, yet get a great deal of play. And it becomes the basis for public policy. For instance, to say these books cannot be shown in libraries, cannot be held in libraries that children might access in those states where this is now the law, because if a child walks into a library and sees a book treating the subject of transgender people, then they are exposed by definition to sexual predatordom, because there is nothing about transgender people that is harmless. They are inherently a threat that will come after the children. So in places like Florida and Oklahoma, public policy now charges teachers with sex crimes for having those kinds of books accessible to children, librarians. It is essentially to the people who ban this, it is essentially to say, as if you made pornography widely available in the children's section. So there is a smear campaign. There is a campaign of lies perpetuated for political reasons against a whole group of people. It is based entirely fictional and propped up by sensationalized accounts that all of which fall apart under scrutiny of transgender people doing evil things, usually to women and children. This is backed by powerful and partially beloved public figures like J.K. Rowling, who you might have heard about as the author of the Harry Potter books. So this is a practical question too, because what do you do if you are transgender or gay and you want to go up against it? It's a local question, because in a school board meeting not too long ago, I think there was Clovis, this very brave young person stood up and addressed them, which was a large crowd of extremely hostile people in the room, to say, I have a right to be myself. I have a right to exist with my identity, sexual orientation, gender identity, and so forth. You seem to not understand that this is something you should feel obliged to grant me. And there is, of course, an assumption in this appeal to your 4-year-olds, to these people who would deny them, that is deeply identitarian, to assume that I'm making this claim on the basis of my identity. I am arguing for the validity of this identity, and I expect you to see it as a valid thing to want to have. There are many, many assumptions here that may be true in and of themselves, but don't really fit the bill, because the people who are coming after you are not interested in it. They do not believe that identity is something that should be protected. They specifically don't believe that yours is a thing, and they'd much rather you disappear from public life or life entirely. So the appeal, the fighting back against these campaigns of smears and lies from people who want progressive things strikes me as hamstrung by having merely the identitarian language and way of thinking about these conflicts available. There is something more that is needed. In my mind, as I have argued on occasion, the approach that says, well, you're just ignorant, you don't know what it's like to be transgender or black or gay or whatever else, and you need to learn, that makes a lot of assumptions that you can't actually make. And it especially ignores that people know who you are. People know what you want, but they have a political system of ideas that can best be described as fascism, and that tells them that it is necessary for good things to happen in the world to destroy you. The world could be good if not for the existence of people like you. Very much this eliminationist element of fascist ideology is not always directed at the same group of people, but it is certainly directed at transgender people right now. So that is a case where you need a concept of individual rights of truth to claims that I get to be this way, I get to be my way, that relies on more than this nominalism, this reigning nominalism. My third example, in the remaining 3 minutes, and I try to make it quick, was from a liberal background, where somebody in a history seminar said, every story is valid. Everybody has their contribution to make. Everybody has their own legitimate thing to say. I objected to it. I rejected that on principle, with the argument that my grandfather, who had fought in the war for the Nazis, has stories to tell about them. So does his best friend, who was a Dutch man, who curiously hasn't set foot in the Netherlands since 1945, where he and my grandfather spent the war years. They certainly tell stories that reflect their lived experience, their values, and their identity as fascists. And they're not valid stories. My uncle, who went through, and if you want the full story of that, the lecture series on fascism, History 134, is on the playlist on YouTube, the whole like 12 or 13 lectures. But my uncle, who was a young socialist kid, working class kid, during the Nazi time, saw and heard everything in the neighborhood. 40 years later, I gave him a book, Oral Histories of that neighborhood. How was it during the Nazi time? He loved that kind of stuff. Maritime history too. He flipped through the index, looked at the names, was like, yep, they were all big supporters. And what did they say here? They suffered under the regime. They were against it from the beginning. No, actually, what this guy did, he voted that person out, and so forth. So you have professional historians in edited volume of oral history containing 50% or more of self-serving lies by people who said, I didn't do anything during fascism. It wasn't my fault. I helped people. And it is all bogus. So no, not all stories are equally valid. Some stories are motivated lies. And it is our job as historians to tell them. Does it make a difference whether I tell that to somebody from my own background or to somebody from another background? That raises the question of what defines what your background is and who your legitimate audience is and group to talk to, if that is something you figure is necessary. Fortunately, I am going to address that question next time. So thank you for your patience.